So, Sarah, we have our new article coming out, Returning to the Root, Radical Feminist Thought and Feminist Theories of International Relations. And in the piece, we make a couple of arguments that radical feminist work has been written out of the history of feminist IR and that the way in which it's been presented has done a disservice to it. What I thought we'd do with today is just record a couple of minutes video discussing the piece and explaining some of our reasons for producing it. To get us started off, I might throw to you, just first up, what does radical feminism mean to you and how do you see it as being different from cultural feminism?
So radical feminism has often in surveys of text been conflated with cultural feminism, but fundamentally it's about identifying the structural basis of inequality between the sexes as being firmly rooted in patriarchy. Whereas cultural feminists, they also recognize patriarchy as the root cause of inequality. They try to reform or address this inequality through revalorizing the feminine, really embracing the idea that women's natural biological feminine characteristics are something that we should value socially, which there's arguments that we could make about how that could be a good thing, but I don't think it's accurate to say that radical feminists embrace this view because, contrary to cultural feminists, they don't believe there's anything essential to our biology that makes women more like this and men more like that. They're more concerned with the social construction of these gender differences and how that reinforces the structure of patriarchy.
Yeah, awesome. So if that's how you'd understand radical feminism, how has it been portrayed within international relations?
So what kind of motivated this article, I think, was the recognition after surveying the sort of generations of textbooks of the representation of feminist theory in IR, that early on we got feminist theory in international relations characterized according to major theoretical strands: liberal, radical, Marxist, socialist, and post-structuralist. But then by around the late 90s, early 2000s, that division of theory got sort of written out, and along with it, no longer did we see any reference to radical feminist thought as being pertinent to international relations at all, which I remember we had these discussions so many years ago. How curious that silence is when certain core concepts that come out of radical feminist thought are still so central to feminist IR today. I think this
Yeah,
would be a good place for me to throw a question to you, David, because part of what we do in this paper is talk about the enduring utility of these core concepts. So I wanted to know what way do you think, let's start with the core concept of patriarchy. What way do you see this as being perhaps under-theorized in our discipline?
I think it's really interesting when you look at a lot of the early work that is being done, like you're saying, in the 1990s, there is this discussion of patriarchy as a structuring factor for international politics. And then as time goes on, particularly with some critiques from authors like Charlotte Hooper, people come collectively to this sort of decision that patriarchy is passe, it's old-fashioned, it's not clear enough. I really think that when you're looking at feminist critiques of the international system, of the international political economy, the absence of patriarchy means that we end up having quite loose critiques of discourses and quite broad understandings of how social constructions of gender might be inaccurate or harmful in different ways, but not necessarily the robust structural foundation of understanding why is it that certain articulations of gender emerge and have salience. Why is it that it's so difficult to shift notions of gender in different times and spaces? And that sort of, I guess, historical and somewhat materialist analysis of gender gets lost in the mix. And what we end up having is an analysis which is very rich on nuance and detail and doesn't have much clarity about the root of the problem or what to do about it.
Which leads me, I think, to another question, which I think you addressed really well in the second half of our paper, which is what areas of contemporary scholarship from feminist IR do you think are ripe for a perhaps reanalysis from a radical feminist perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would say lots of areas in sort of really broad terms, but the one thing that always comes up to me about radical feminist work, and I've been teaching it last week for my second year students in a course on oppression and resistance, is they are so before their time in terms of having this clear critique of heterosexuality, of sexual relations, of the eroticization of difference and of subordination as the route to a bunch of forms of gender oppression. And I think that in a sort of milieu of 90s choice feminism, that got lost. And really this analysis of sexuality, of the heteronormative family relationship as a constitutive oppressive factor of our political economy and our societies is really valuable. And I think in practice, if that work gets drawn on, that's going to really enrich our work on militarism in the household, which is coming really significantly within work on international political economy. I think it has a still tremendous amount to say about the way in which feminists are theorizing feminist foreign policy and international relations. You know, this idea that we've got a sort of very, I guess, often still quite fluffy version of empowerment feminism without that root critique of, no, we really need to fundamentally shift, rebuild, and change basic institutions of the family of sexuality. So there'd be a couple, but I mean, I think that it's a sort of rich area for further exploration. For my last question, what I was wondering is we in the piece argue that radical feminism is portrayed as being sort of old, outdated, passe, and therefore no longer useful. Why is it that it's harmful to present radical feminism as old, passe, outdated, and therefore past its relevance?
I mean, there's a few problems with this representation. The first is that, I mean, it's not accurate. There are still very robust radical feminist theorizations happening in other disciplines, in other areas of social sciences, and particularly in philosophy, that we are just not participating in as a discipline. But it's also really problematic because it helps reinforce a version of a history or a telling of a story about feminist theory within our discipline that is not really doing justice to the breadth of ideas that we could be drawing on. And what I mean by this is, you know, drawing from Claire Hemming's very powerful book called Why Stories Matter, she talks about how, depending on what camp you're sitting in, really, we have a tendency to talk about the history of feminist thought through one of a variety of narratives. And so the problem I think we're seeing perhaps in feminist IR is the tendency to draw on this progress narrative, this idea that feminist theory is developing teleologically towards some sort of perfect end state where there's no contestation, that there's resolved debates, and we all have, you know, profound agreement on basic premises like the agency structure problem. And this, to me, is actually quite deeply unresolved in feminist theory, and it would be useful for us to keep that door open in our own discipline as well, to go back to really core questions about, like, what is the role of the state in maintaining patriarchal relations, as you say, in the family, but also what does that mean for relations at the international level as well. My last question that I had for you, David, which is, similarly in this progress narrative, one of the reasons I think that people have justified writing radical feminism out of the history of feminist IR or thought in feminist international relations is some of the broad critiques about it being essentialist and unable to account for differences, being too universalizing about the experiences of women. What do you think we should say, or what could we say in the face of these claims about the reasons we might still see value in returning to radical feminist thought?
I always find this critique, I guess, in some ways interesting and a bit odd, because there's absolutely lots of examples that you can find of radical feminists making statements that veer on essentialism or that don't recognize different experiences from different class or racial or sexualities. But that is not a unique problem to radical feminism. And the idea, for example, that feminist international relations has always been fantastic on integrating race, sexuality, gender diversity into our analysis is patently untrue. I think also that there's, again, this really harmful approach to this history of radical feminist work, where you sort of say radical feminism is a middle-class white women's movement in the United States, which erases all of the history that you have of the very diverse groups of women who were involved in radical feminist theorization. And you apply, for example, the analysis you have from Black lesbian radical feminists like Audre Lorde critiquing other radical feminists, and then use it to say that radical feminism was all white, all essentialist, and all outdated. And this, I think, is a really important aspect of feminist politics, is not sort of pretending that there is purity and accuracy in all of the aspects of work that we draw on. And, you know, you can still draw on the material from people who do things and get things wrong. And that when we present our history as a sort of backward facing interpretation of a whole diverse movement that totally disagreed on a bunch of different issues, that I think gets us into a lot of hot water. But in practice, I think a lot of it actually just comes from people not having read the material from the sort of zenith of the radical feminist movement. I think my impression is that a lot of people have read a few excerpts from Mary Daly and a few excerpts from Firestone, and then use that to say this is what radical feminism had to say. And in its worst cases, what you have is people not reading it at all, reading other people's summaries of the original texts, which tend to be selective in what they read, selective in their interpretation of it, and not necessarily generous in contextualizing the different debates that were happening at the time. And I think that there's a lot to be learned, not by romanticizing radical feminism in the sort of 70s and 60s as a perfect movement that needs no revision or integration at all, but by saying we have a lot to learn by these conversations that are being had in the past that are still going on now. I think about the debates on sexuality and queer politics in contemporary IR feminist theory, and think we have really lost a lot of resources by not going back to a bunch of that earlier work, you know, by authors like Adrienne Rich on, you know, compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence. Yeah, so I think that the critiques around essentialism, there is essentialism in a bunch of texts, but there is in lots of other areas too. And we just need to have a bit more of a balanced approach to how we consider the legacy of that work and the theorization in light of it.
I think we could also perhaps have a bit of discussion about the start of our process in coming to writing this article. If you remember, the year was 2014. We were both recently completed PhD students, is that right?
Yeah, I would have just finished.
So it was 2014. We had recently completed our PhDs. Were trying to make some headway in this new field, in this new discipline, as new voices in the field, and recognizing that there was a surprising degree of perhaps uniformity of representation of feminism. Is that how you remember our early discussions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your memory is maybe more generous and less angry than the original discussions might have been. I think this paper has really benefited from a lot of rounds of critical commentary from people to encourage us to be more balanced. But I think then and still, my impression was, wow, people really do not like a bunch of theorists like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dawkins, who I find really valuable and really helpful in this space. And the sort of existing tension that came between feminist IR work that was interested in institutionalism and integrating norms into around gender equality, and those who are working, I guess, from more deconstructive approaches. To me, in between that, I felt, where is the space for a more structural approach? Now, there is work being done on that from, socialist feminists in the UK, but it did just feel like that voice was missing. What do you remember from those sort of early discussions?
Yeah, now you are jogging my memory now, because I think at the time I had recently read Laura Schoberg's Gendering Global Conflict, and her third chapter of the book, I believe, is where she directly engages with Waltz's third image and a structural account of what gender is doing in international relations. And I remember being quite blown away by this, that this was for the first time somebody really systematically laying out how is gender a structural feature of the international system, and what work is it doing. And I was so motivated by that work, by that piece, in the work that I was doing at the time, trying to look at the causes of war and conditions of armed conflict. And I remember being met with quite a bit of resistance in the conference circuit, presenting paper that I was working on at the time. And so I think that was when I first realized in our discussions that this structural theorizing had actually gone by the wayside in feminist IR. And if it weren't for Laura Schoberg, I think our citation analysis would probably generate almost no reference to Catherine McKinnon's work across feminist IR in the last 30 years.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to me how often the critiques of structural thinking within feminist IR do not engage with the original thinkers who are actually making these arguments for a structural analysis of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. And that all too often what you end up having is through citations, where people will cite someone who is critiquing someone else who is citing someone else, and it's this, and ending up being this sort of really pernicious perception of what radical feminist structural thinking around patriarchy was, without necessarily people engaging with the nuances there. I mean, there is a lot of robust language in early radical feminist writing, but there is also a lot of conversation and disagreement. It's not this singular vision of what structural thinking can be. And I really think we've got a lot to gain by going back and revisiting that.
Well, exactly. Even if it's to try and add that nuance after the fact, right? Because we also have to remember the context in which a lot of this work was written. It was not in the academy. It was not for academic audiences. It wasn't to please article editors or reviewers. It was for advancing a political agenda. It was meant to be incendiary. It was meant to incite political action. And so, of course, they were, very broad, general, and inflammatory calls to arms. But that wasn't to say that they weren't recognizing also some nuance in these texts. And so one of the things that I really enjoyed doing in this article was going back to the what are they called? The manifestos of the various radical feminist groups that were written in the late 60s, early 70s. And the surprising amount of recognition of class, race, sexualities as markers of difference of experience for women was surprising to me, because of all I had read within our discipline and in more later feminist theory texts about how radical feminism was bad on these points.
Yeah, and you do sometimes get the misinterpretation that these were not conversations people were having. And there were people who were arguing that race wasn't as important, but that was not a universal view. That was a view that was being strongly debated within these groups and within these movements. And you see it in those manifestos and in those community organizing principles that they were actively discussing what's the relationship between race and gender or sexuality and class. It wasn't this sort of monolithic depiction that we have today. And I, part of me feels like we end up doing patriarchy's work by presenting these radical feminists as old, outdated, radical fuddy-duddies who just don't understand that they need to co-opt enough to get along with patriarchy. And I mean, who needs oppressors with friends like these? We can work harder to actually represent the messy histories with lots of flaws and failings, but in a way which is showing generosity and solidarity as well.
I think that's key, the generosity and solidarity, because ultimately, I suppose what we would like from this article and from feminist IR work in general is just a commitment to feminist praxis, right? To an ethic of a shared agenda, despite our differences in terms of particular perspectives or ideas of how that's advanced, but rather keeping our eye, let's say, on who the real enemy is.